where the gods unmade Lorcan and left their adamantine Tower of Secrets, where the mortal world of Mundus intersects with the infinity of Oblivion and the eternity of Aetherius. Many temporal rulers have tried to tame it over the millennia, but only those blessed by the divines have succeeded. Welcome to the Wizards and Warriors video on the history of the Elder Scrolls universe, and our first video in which we'll explore the history of Tamriel from the perspective of the empires of men, with a focus on the third and most famous of these empires, that of the Septim dynasty, the blood of Talos Stormcrown. Powerful bloodlines are all important in many fantasy settings, none more so than our sponsor Bloodline Heroes of Lethus. It's a unique RPG where you pair up powerful champions to create offspring that mix their traits, allowing you to gradually improve your bloodline and select the most powerful heirs to be the champions of your kingdom. And it's free on either Android or iOS. You can log in for free to get the Dragonborn clan Karg, one of many champion clans, also including the powerful Lycanis werewolves. Then take a companion from the demigod clan Fulgar. Later as you level up you'll get more and more companion options, by the way. After that you'll get a free half Dragonborn half demigod heir to further your kingdom. You'll need their power to tackle the economic, political and military matters you'll face. And in time they'll lend their power to an even greater next generation. And the more intimacy you develop with your companions, the stronger the offspring. By mixing different bloodlines and combining traits, you can create the ultimate heirs. You can get the game for free on Android or iOS via our link in the description, or with the QR code on screen. And of course use our special code BLDHOL1 to get a free champion token, 100,000 gold and 100 diamonds right away. Go meet some true companions in this one-of-a-kind RPG. The earliest known inhabitants of the continent later called Tamriel were the Beast Folk, ancient ancestors of the reptilian Argonians and the feline Khajiit, among others like the ape-like Imga and now extinct Fox Folk and Bird Folk. Next came the Aldmer, the Elder Folk, who millennia before made landfall on what is now Alinor or the Somerset Isles. This began the Metheric era, the Age of Elves. From Alinor, the Aldmer would begin their colonization of the mainland, pushing the Beastfolk into the uninhabitable deserts, jungles and swamps on the edges of the continent. In the center of Cyrodiil, they built the White Gold Tower, which forever would become a symbol of imperial power for whoever controlled it. As generations passed, the Elder Folk became increasingly divided. Those who populated modern-day Morrowind became the Chimmer, ancestors of the modern Dark Elves. Concurrently, the Elves of the White Gold Tower had slowly evolved into the Eyelids, or Heartland Wild Elves. These two peoples worshipped the demonic Daedra of Oblivion, something their Aldmer ancestors had strictly forbidden. Some elves became the Dwemer, or Deep Folk, rejecting the superiority of all gods and secluding themselves in deep underground technocratic societies. Those who disappeared into the deep forests of Valenwood became the wild and carnivorous Bosmer, Wood Elves, and those who lived in High Rock or stayed in Alinor became the Altmer, High Elves, the closest descendants of the original Aldmer. No one seems to agree on how and when the races of men arrived on Tamriel. If Nordic legend is to be believed, then they were created on Skyrim's highest mountain, where the sky goddess Kine formed them with her breath. In any case, by the Middle Merethic era, a diversity of early human tribes had dispersed across Tamriel. In most places, they were forced to become subordinate to the elves. In High Rock, the men were subjugated under the local Altmer clan, the Direni, who began taking on human concubines and producing half-blooded children, resulting in a magically gifted race, the ancestors of the modern Breton people. Meanwhile, the menfolk who found themselves in Cyrodiil were indiscriminately enslaved by the Eyelids, who subjected them to horrific tortures like flesh sculpting and gut gardening. This was often done at the behest of their cruel Daedric overlords, who rewarded those depravities by giving the Eyelids armies of Daedric creatures to command. However, as the Merethic Age passed into the First Era, the balance of power between men and Mer would shift. The turning tide was when the ancestors of the modern Nords began a multi-generational exodus from their ancestral homeland in northern Atmora back into Skyrim, the land of their mother, Kain. There, they encountered the Falmer, or Snow Elves. Relations were initially peaceful, until the Falmer attacked the Nordic city of Sarthal, massacring its population. But they didn't finish the job, for a warrior named Iskramor was able to escape and return to Atmora. There he recruited a mighty army, known as the 500 Companions, and returned to wreak an act of genocidal revenge on the Snow Elves, claiming Skyrim for the Nords. While this was happening, a slave in Cyrodiil, praying on the sacred hill of Sankrator, had received a vision from Akatosh, the king of the dragons. The chief of the divines had imbued her with the blood of dragons and gifted her the magically imbued Amulet of Kings. Akatosh promised that so long as men were ruled by a dragonborn who bore the amulet, the gates of Oblivion would remain closed, depriving the Aelids of their demonic soldiers. This slave who received this vision was named Alessia, and now charged by divine blessing, she became a queen, leading a massive uprising that captured the White Gold Tower from the Aelids in year 243 of the First Era. Alessia died in 266, but she left behind the First Empire of Men, whose dragon-blooded emperors would sit atop the ruby throne in the White Gold Tower for the next 2,000 years. Now free from Elvish rule, the modern Mannish races of Tamriel began to form. In High Rock, centuries of warfare with Nords and Alessians had left the Direni High Elves near death, allowing for their human descendants, the magically inclined Bretons, to become the hegemons of that region, while in Skyrim, the Nordic culture flourished. While elven kingdoms persisted in Alinor, Valenwood and Morrowind, it was now clear that the Age of Myr was over and the Age of Men had begun. Despite this, Alessia's realm was never able to unite humanity. The proudly independent Nords never accepted imperial rule, while the Alessian control over the capricious Breton sorcerer kings was always tenuous at best. Meanwhile, on the horizons beyond Strassum Kai, a whole new Mannish enemy would emerge. Having sundered their own homeland of Yakuda, the Ragada, or Red Guards as they came to be known, arrived in Tamriel in 808 of the First Era, swiftly and brutally conquering the Alikir Desert and annihilating its native populations. By First Era 2331, Alessia's empire was dissolved, crushed under the weight of internal religious struggles. Consequently, Cyrodiil fractured into numerous petty kingdoms for the next 400 years. But soon, an empire, ruled rightfully by a dragonborn ruler, would rise again. According to myth, the seeds of the Second Empire were sown when the 2,000-year-old spirit of Alessia, bound to the hill of Sankrator, participated in a divine conception with a mad king named Hrol. In his efforts to make love with a magic mountain, Hrol would expire, leaving an infant with Akatosh's divine Amulet of Kings embedded into his forehead, a dragon-blooded child named Remen, the Light of Man. Young Remen's first test came in 2703 of the First Era, when the Seiski, natives of the mythical eastern continent of Akavir, landed on the northern coast of Tamriel. Some claim the Seiski were exotic snake-like creatures, while others say they were a wayward race of men. Either way, these invaders tore through the armies of the Nords, before garrisoning themselves at a mountain keep called Pale Pass. Remen utilized the Akaviri threat to unite all of the disparate lords of Cyrodiil under him. He then marched to Pale Pass to confront the invaders. Yet in a strange turn of events, as soon as the Seiski heard Remen's voice, they poured out of their keep and prostrated themselves before him, claiming that they had finally found what they had come to Tamriel to seek, the Dragonborn. And just like that, Remen was the most powerful man in Tamriel, not only with all of Cyrodiil at his back, but now also supported by the mighty Snake Men, who he incorporated into a special unit, the Dragon Guard. During his reign, and that of his successors, the Empire of Man was born anew. In the Heartlands, a mixture of Nordic, Breton and native Cyrodiilic cultures gave rise to the modern imperial race, which achieved what the Alessians could not when they incorporated Skyrim, High Rock and Hammerfell into their growing domain. Before long, even the domains of elves and beastfolk, fearing the Remenite armies, nominally swore fealty to the Second Empire of Men. The lone exception were the Dark Elves of Morrowind, who after a mild kerfuffle involving the heart of Lorkhan, now unexisted Dwemer, and being universally cursed by Daedric Prince Azura, were ruled by a tribunal of nigh undefeatable living gods who killed the third Remenite Emperor, Reman II, in battle. This led the Second Empire to go into decline, and in First Era 2920, the Teyski Dragon Guard launched a coup against his successor, Reman III, deposing him and creating a regime known as the Akaviri Potentate. The extinction of the House of Reman marked the end of the First Era, and 430 years later, the assassination of the last Teyski Potentate resulted in the end of the empire they had built. The line of Dragonborn emperors was once again broken, and the Amulet of Kings was once again missing, and Tamriel was once again divided. It is here that our story finally arrives upon the birth of the man of many names, Talos Stormcrown, Tiberius Imperator, the mortal who became a god. Tiber Septim was born in Second Era 828, though we know little else about his early life. Centuries later, Imperial Orthodoxy would claim that he was born in Atmora, and that his birth name was Talos, meaning Stormcrown in Old Elnifex. However, a contradictory account known as the Arcturian Heresy claims he was born on the island of Alker in High Rock, and his birth name was Hajalti Earlybeard. Whatever his origins, Hajalti Talos spent his youth in Skyrim, where the hardy Nords groomed him to be a warrior, teaching him to wield not just sword and axe, but also his own voice. For centuries, the Nords had utilized the Storm Voice, or Thum, a form of magic that they had been taught by the dragons. For even the most powerful of Nords, it took many years of training to master even a few words of the dragon tongue. But young Talos took to it naturally, and in a remarkably short time was able to shout as forcefully as the eldest and most powerful of dragons. As a teen, Talos found himself in the service of Cuchulainn, the petty king of Falkreath. Due to his powerful command of the Thum, Cuchulainn quickly made Talos his general, a decision which paid off when the Dragonborn were sent to conquer the Reachmen, a wild offshoot of the Bretons native to the titular Reach region of Skyrim. With only a small band of Nordic warriors and Western Cyrodiils, known as the Colovians, Hajalti carved through the tribes of the Reachmen and their briar-hearted kings with ease, until he had forced them back into the fortress of Old Hroldan. At first, the Reachmen were confident, heckling Hajalti from the safety of their high walls, but then a fierce storm broke out. Imbued with power, the Dragonborn general shouted down the walls of Old Hroldan with his mighty Thum and stormed the keep, officially annexing the Reach into Cuchulainn's domain. Hajalti was only 20 at this time. It is likely here where, awed by his mighty powers, his soldiers began to call him Talos, Stormcrown. After Old Hroldan fell, the sky darkened and thunder rolled across the sky. From the monastery of High Hrothgar atop the sacred throat of the world, the Greybeards spoke Talos' name, and the world shook. The Greybeards were the most sacred of Nordic institutions, a coven of wise monks, who, other than the Dragonborn, were the most powerful Thum users in the world. One does not take their summons lightly, and so Talos made his pilgrimage up High Hrothgar. There, the Greybeards heralded him as Ysmir, Dragon of the North. They declared him to be Dragonborn, perhaps the first since Reman, and told him that, like all Dragonborn who came before him, he was prophesied to unite Tamriel. In the wake of his recent conquests, Talos had attracted new enemies, jealous of his growing power. In 2E 852, an alliance of Nordic freeholds and Breton kingdoms crossed the border into Cyrodiil, where they occupied the major passes in the Gerol Mountains and settled into the ancient and sacred city of Sankrator, where Alessia had received her divine vision from Akatosh millennia ago. From there, the Nords and Bretons made plans to conquer the entirety of Tamriel, and dared the supposedly invincible General Stormborn to try and stop them. Thus began the event which would launch Stormborn into greatness, the Battle of Sankrator. It was the dead of winter when Talos received this provocation, but he was never one to turn down a challenge and immediately marched south from Falkreath. We can assume that to avoid the Breton Nordic garrisons in the Gerald Mountain passes, Talos marched his armies right over the mountains themselves, like a general from a state called Carthage in another universe. As a result, when Talos' army of Colovian legionaries descended upon the Cyrodiilic plains at the foot of the Gerals, they were short on rations, exhausted, poorly outfitted, and overall unprepared for winter campaigning. At a glance, the Nord-Breton alliance had the overwhelming force. While Talos had been marching, they had turned Sankrator into an impregnable redoubt. High walls built atop an unscalable cliff face dominated the front of the fortress. The only entrance to the fort lay in its rear, in a mountain basin at the base of equally unscalable heights and concealed by a massive illusion conjured by the Breton battle mages, who had created an ephemeral lake over the basin, concealing the fort gate that lay within it. Before long, Talos had arrived in the lowlands beneath the citadel, assembling his ragged, exhausted levies in plain view of the Bretons and Nords in the castle above. So weak, vulnerable, and small in number did they look, that the alliance decided there wasn't any need to wait out their foe from the safety of their fortress. Instead, they sallied out of Sankrator in force, leaving only a small garrison within the walls, while the rest would charge and overwhelm Talos' host. A fatal underestimation of their foe, which would prove to be their undoing. Unbeknownst to the alliance, Talos had managed to secure the loyalty of a secret Breton defector, and through either intimidation or cajolement, had convinced him to reveal the secret of Sankrator's concealed entrance. Furthermore, the supposedly feeble nature of Talos' army was also a ruse, for the Colovians in the lowlands in front of the fort represented only a small rearguard, while the rest, acting on the defector's information, had secretly snuck around the fortress, descended the supposedly unscalable cliffs, and penetrated the illusionary lake. The coup de grace soon followed. The bulk of the Bretons and Nords charged down into the lowlands, swamping the Colovian rearguard, who despite being massively outnumbered, held true and never broke their lines. Meanwhile, the Dragonborn had used his thum to shout down the citadel gate, and with the cream of his troops, stormed inside and annihilated its small defense force, capturing the Nord-Breton nobles who remained in the fort. Seeing that Sankrator had fallen, the alliance's morale quickly plummeted and then fell apart entirely. The confused and demoralized Nord captives, suspicious of the scheming Breton sorcerer's territorial ambitions, and awed by Stormcrown's dragonborn nature, which was sacred to them, deserted the Bretons and swore loyalty to Talos. The Skyrim generals joined their rank and file in Stormcrown's army, while the High Rock battle mage command was summarily executed and the captive Bretons imprisoned or sold into slavery. Following his great triumph, Talos took a somber tour through the ancient catacombs of Sankrator, where the ancient dragonborn rulers of Man lay entombed. Passing among the presence of Saint Alessia, Remen, and those of their sacred bloodlines, he came upon the tomb of Remen III, the last emperor of Man. Upon his remains, Talos found the Amulet of Kings, the sacred artifact of mankind's covenant to the most holy Akatosh. In Tamriel, one should never attribute to coincidence what can be explained by fate, and with the ancient amulet in his hands, the Dragon of the North no doubt felt the prophecy of the Greybeards slowly coming to fruition. But for now, Talos was not yet an emperor, but a general serving under King Cuchulainn. And indeed, under Talos' invincible generalship and his mighty thum, kingdom after kingdom fell into Cuchulainn's domain. Within only a few months of Sankrator, Talos had brought the Colovian estates of Western Cyrodiil under Cuchulainn's rule, and the eastern merchant lords of Nibene soon followed. Finally, in Second Era 854, Talos marched into the Imperial City, home of the White Gold Tower, where the Remenite emperors had once lit the sacred dragon fires in the temples of Akatosh, which marked their imperial rule. With the Imperial Heartland now under his control, Cuchulainn now intended to have himself crowned emperor, with his invincible General Talos at his side. But Cuchulainn was no Dragonborn, and could never wield the Amulet of Kings, thus his reign was never meant to be. What happened next is a matter of fierce debate. Some claim that a Reachman assassin managed to sneak into the Imperial Palace and assassinate the would-be emperor, while Talos, attempting to defend his liege, had his throat cut, but managed to survive. Others claim that it was Talos himself who murdered Cuchulainn, and after the act, slit his own throat to deflect suspicion. Whatever the case, it would be the Dragon of the North, bearing the Amulet of Kings and renewing the ancient pact with Akatosh, ascended as the first Dragonborn Emperor of the Third Empire of Man. The damage to his throat would leave Talos permanently crippled, and he would never shout again. But he would conquer. Cyrodiil was his, but Cyrodiil was just the beginning. Just as the Greybeards prophesied, Stormcrown was destined to unite all the provinces of Tamriel under him. Not as Talos, however, but as a man reborn. An emperor who took on a new name in honor of his adopted imperial homeland, Tiber Septim. The tale of how the Dragon of the North united men, elves, and beastfolk has been told a dozen ways, with each version possessing extraneous details that directly contradict the others. As such, the story we are about to present to you is merely our interpretation of events, based on the two most substantial yet contradicting records of the Tiber Wars, the official imperial narrative, published by the Pocket Guide to the Empire, and the controversial Arcturian heresy. We should begin with a brief introduction to two men who would be critical in helping Stormcrown fulfill his expansionist ambitions. First was Ysmir Wulfharth. Wulfharth was an ancient High King of Skyrim, reigning thousands of years before the first age of Talos Stormcrown. If legend is to be believed, Wulfharth met his end in a duel with the death god Orki, hyper-aging himself to expiry while using his Thum to reverse a curse which had reverted Skyrim's people into childhood. But time and again, allegedly through the will of the Nordic creator god Sjor, his ashes would re-manifest into living form, effectively making him immortal. Throughout the First Era, this Ash King would develop a searing hatred for the Elves of Morrowind, whose leaders had stolen the heart of his beloved Sjor and defiled it by drawing from its power to turn themselves into gods. Throughout many resurrections he tried to vanquish them, but time and again the Chimmer, and later their Dunmer descendants, blasted him back into ash. In the late Second Era, the Ash King reincarnated once more and attached his cause to Talos. As per the prophecy of the Greybeards, it would be Stormcrown who would finally unite Tamriel and defeat the Elves. Beyond Wulfharth, Talos had another key lieutenant, the brilliant sorcerer Zurin Arctus, who by some accounts was one of the most powerful magic users in Tamrielic history. Different stories explain Zurin's massive arcane powers in different ways, the most popular of which claim he was a reincarnation of Magnus, the father god of magic. In any case, Zurin had served Talos since he was a mere general in Cuchulainn's employ, and upon his crowning as Emperor Tiber Septim, became his chief battle mage. In the 854th year of the Second Era, the Never Emperor Cuchulainn was assassinated, and in his place, Talos, known now by his Cyrodiilic name of Tiber Septim, relit the ancient dragonfires of Alesia and Remen and declared himself first Emperor of the Third Empire of Tamriel. But there was still much to do, for while Cyrodiil and the Reachlands were now his, the rest of the continent remained yet unconquered. The remaining independent human kingdoms would be the first dominoes to fall. Skyrim swore fealty to Tiber with little resistance. After all, he had grown up there, and the Jarls saw him as one of their own. No doubt Ash King Wulfharth, the Tongue of Sjor, also had an influence in the integration of his erstwhile realm into the Third Empire. High Rock was soon to follow. The Bretons had long been divided into a patchwork of petty feudal kingdoms, which made them all the easier for the united forces of Skyrim and Cyrodiil to steamroll through. Ironically, the Nords and Bretons, whose plans to conquer Cyrodiil had been foiled by Tiber at Sankrator, were now ruled by an emperor who had been raised by Nords and probably was born a Breton. After these conquests, only one human realm remained outside the Third Empire. Indeed, the Imperials were about to clash headlong against the warriors from Hammerfell and their curved swords. The late Second Era had actually been an era of unprecedented peace for the Redguards. The threat of the growing Third Empire on their eastern border had compelled the kingdom's two feuding factions, the Crowns and Forebears, to unite under the rule of High King Thasad II, who himself was a Crown, but was evidently moderate enough to keep peace between both sides. However, when Thasad died in Second Era 862, and was replaced by his more radically pro-Crown son, Prince Ator, old rivalries resurfaced and civil war quickly engulfed the Alikir once more. Tiber's window into the Redguard realm came when Baron Volag, the leader of the Forebears, sent ambassadors to plead with the Emperor for help in their struggle. Volag was losing ground to the Crowns and had finally grown desperate enough to make a deal with the proverbial devil on their doorstep, promising Tiber fealty to the Third Empire in exchange for help in vanquishing their ancient Crown enemies. The Emperor wasted no time accepting this offer, and within the year, the full might of the Imperial legions had been brought to bear upon Hammerfell, pushing the forces of the Crowns to the sea. Prince Ator put up a fiery resistance, but he was simply too far outnumbered, and before long retreated with what remained of his navy to the last Crown stronghold, the island of Strassum. In Second Era 864, Stormcrown appointed his finest naval commander, Admiral Amiel Richten, to dislodge this last wedge of native resistance. Thus the Imperial New West Navy, Pride of Colovia, sailed to Strassum, where they encountered the Royal Navy of Hammerfell, led by Prince Ator himself, in the open waters just beyond the harbour of Port Hunding. Accounts on the composition of the opposing forces are sparse, but it would not be unreasonable to assume that the Imperial ships outnumbered the Crowns by a significant margin. Nevertheless, Prince Ator was no coward, and immediately signalled his fleet to draw up into a battle line and engage their foe. We can assume that the Redguards used their sleek vessels to dance around Imperial warships, relying on lightning boarding tactics as they leapt from one deck to another, engaging in brutal melees as Imperial battle mages and archers flung fire and arrows in a vain attempt to prevent their landings. In the thick of it all was the Redguard Prince, ferrying his flagship to fight wherever the battle was most intense. These were conditions unfavourable to standard Imperial battle conventions. As the war manual of Zurin Arctus states, a close-fought battle is to be avoided. The fortunes of war may turn aside the most powerful sorcery, and courage may undo the best-laid plans. Thus, one can imagine that the fast-paced and up-close ferocity of the Ragada warrior wave kept the Empire's marines on the perpetual back foot. Despite his numerical advantage, Richten saw the tide of battle slowly turning against him. But the Imperial Admiral had one card left up his sleeve, a secret weapon, one he had been reluctant to use, but now had no choice but to do so. In the age before recorded history, dragons had ruled the men of the north, but when men had learned to shout as dragons do, their supremacy had been overthrown. Then, in the Second Era, when the Snake Men of Akavir came, they slaughtered nearly all the Dova, leaving very few remaining on Tamriel. Proud and arrogant immortal beings, it is in a dragon's nature to seek to dominate mortals, but as their numbers dwindled, a select few made the fateful decision to submit and serve the race of men. So it was that on that fateful day of Second Era 854, a pair of red wings blot out the sun over Hunding Bay. Nafalar the Red, loyal soldier of Tiber Septim, had been ordered into the fray. Knowing that a torrent of dragonfire could easily annihilate his fleet, Prince Ator signalled his ships to pull back, scatter, and concentrate their ranged weapons upon Nafalar. But it was at that fateful moment that a poisoned arrow, loosed by a renegade Dunmer assassin wielding the legendary Daedric Bow of Shadows, found the prince's flesh. Ator's archmage, Voa, was able to preserve the dying prince's soul in a soul gem, but moments later, a stream of dragon flame sunk the Redguard flagship to the bottom of the sea. Using the confusion caused by the death of the Crown Commander, the dragon attacked the fleet relentlessly, making them hastily retreat towards the harbour of Strassum Kai in the Hunding Bay. Most of the troops disembarked at the well-fortified Old Quarter, hoping its high walls would protect them. In response, Rickton simply ordered Nafalar to burn down the entire section of the city with all the crowns inside, leaving no survivors. The Battle of Hunding Bay was a decisive victory for the Imperials, and with the final bastion of Crown resistance broken, Hammerfell was fully annexed into the Third Empire. Rather than give power to the forebears as had been promised, Emperor Tiber instead decided to appoint Cyrodiilic governors throughout the province, with Admiral Rickton in overall regional command. The proud Redguards chafed under direct foreign rule, and soon a province-wide revolt had broke out. This ended in success for the rebels when the renegade Redguard hero Cyrus slew Nafalar and severely weakened Imperial control in the region. As a result, the Empire was forced to sign the Treaty of Strassum Kai. Hammerfell would remain a part of the Empire, but with significant internal autonomy for both crowns and forebears, who would continue to bicker amongst themselves under Imperial suzerainty. In any case, Tiber Septim had done what a century ago seemed impossible, and united all the human nations of Tamriel under his banner. Following the annexation of Hammerfell, the rest of unconquered Tamriel was made up of non-human lands, whose native populations lived in ashy wastes, primordial woodlands, jungles, deserts or swamps, all territory that could not be conquered conventionally. This forced Tiber to think outside the box. Generally speaking, he employed a tactic where his armies would blitzkrieg over a border, win some quick victories, then offer an armistice where the native population would be offered autonomy of culture, faith and self-rule in return for allegiance to the Dragon Crown. This prevented the need for Imperial legions to engage in long, protracted campaigns in otherwise untamable lands. This was likely what occurred in the Khajiiti homeland of Elsewhere. When Imperial forces initially crossed into the Catlands, they conquered parts of the historical northern region of Aniquina and cast out all the native Khajiit there. After the city of Senchal refused to surrender to Imperial General Potreed, Cyrodiilic forces stormed its walls and massacred every man, woman and cub inside. This slaughter would later be omitted from the Empire's official histories. In any case, Elsewhere was soon after assimilated into the Third Empire. To prevent a perpetual guerrilla war, the Catfolk were placated by being allowed to retain their customs, with their traditional spiritual leader, the Mane, retaining temporal authority over them. Things would play out slightly differently with the Lizard Folk. Rare was the man who would walk willingly into Blackmarsh. Only a few generations had passed since the Nahatan plague had spread out of that region, while the Argonians themselves were hostile to all outsiders, able to strike effortlessly like shadows. Even Tiber saw the futility of trying to fully subdue such an alien land, so he contented himself with just conquering its outer coastlines, and when the Argonian resistance retreated into the swampy heart of their province, the Imperials dared not follow, knowing only disease and death awaited them, with little to gain in return. With that said, the Empire now considered all Beastfolk lands to be officially subdued, and so Tiber looked to his next conquest, and his gaze fell to the east, to Morrowind. Always had the Dark Elves of Restane resisted the conquests of men. The Ash King Wulfharth was Tiber's active reminder of this. In the late Second Era, Morrowind was ruled by Almalexia, Sothosil and Vivec, the same tribunal of living gods that had presided over the Dunmer for millennia. The soldiers of Cyrodiil dreaded an invasion of Morrowind. In their eyes, nothing lay east but a land of barren ash, peopled by demon-eyed fanatics. If the Arcturian heresy is to be believed, then even Stormcrown himself was reluctant to provoke the Dark Elves, and had to be constantly pressured by the Ash King, who was desperate to finally vanquish his ancient foes. Ultimately, Tibur was swayed, likely due to the rich ebony deposits in the region. Thus, an invasion fleet was amassed along the northern coast of Skyrim, while the Imperial legions massed along northeastern Cyrodiil. Soon, Imperial legions advanced into Morrowind, meeting with dogged resistance the whole way. Nevertheless, the soldiers of the Dragon Banner were able to push through to the capital of Mournhold, sacking the city. Seeing where the wind was blowing, Vivek, the warrior poet of the Tribunal, agreed to treat with the Emperor, and an arrangement was struck. Morrowind would join the Empire, but as a fully autonomous province, with all rights of faith and self-government. This arrangement allowed Tibur to avoid the catastrophic losses that would certainly result otherwise. But there was a cost. For now, the Emperor had to deal with the wrath of his immortal Ash King, who was furious that the Tribunal would not be destroyed. Feeling betrayed that the man prophesied to vanquish the heretical elves instead collaborated with them, Wulfharth abandoned the Septim cause. A setback to be sure, but the loss of Wulfharth was a small price to pay, for peace with the Tribunal had yielded the Emperor something far more valuable, the Big Walker Numidium. The Numidium was a massive skyscraper-sized metal golem, originally made by the hyper-advanced Dwemer in their vain quest to create a new god, powered by the heart of Lorkhan, that would help them transcend the mortal plane. It was precisely this ill-fated attempt to achieve divinity that caused the Dwemer to vanish from Nurn. After the disappearance of its creators, the Numidium came into the possession of the Dunmer Tribunal, who in turn gave it as a peace offering to Tibur Septim. After all, what harm could it do? Lorkhan's heart was safely guarded under Red Mountain, and without it, Numidium was but a brass shell with no soul. By now, the only remaining nucleus of resistance against the Septim Empire on Tamriel was the Altmeri Dominion, a political union between the Bosmer of Valenwood and the Altmer of Alinor. Prior to the rise of Talos, the Dominion had been the most powerful state in Tamriel, but now the continent was polarized between them and the Third Empire. Indeed, elsewhere had been a Dominion client state before its annexation into the Empire. Suffice to say, tensions were sky high, and total war between men and Mer was inevitable. Armed conflict began in the Second Era 887, and would rage on for 9 years. The Imperial legions advanced into Valenwood, and between its extremely dense primeval forests and savage cannibalistic Bosmer natives, we can assume the campaign was no holiday. Imperial troops were able to push deep into Ifra's domain, but the Wood Elves, no doubt with High Elf aid, made the invaders pay for every inch with a pound of blood. Nevertheless, the Empire was soon again in a position to make the usual offer: religious and cultural freedom in exchange for submission. Valenwood henceforth became a province of the Empire, while maintaining a king from its ancient Camoran dynasty as a figurehead, and limited internal rule through a council of tribal chieftains. If the subjugation of the Wood Elves had been grueling, following up with the High Elves would be nigh on impossible. The Altmer homeland was an island stronghold, protected not only by a royal navy that far outclassed its imperial counterpart, but by Tamriel's most powerful sorcerers, wielding dawn magics barely comprehensible to the average human mage. Trying to land an army in Alinor was clearly a futile endeavour. That is, until Zurin Arctus approached Tibur with fateful news: Numidium was finished. Long had the Imperial battle mage laboured over the pieces of the god robot, meticulously assembling the Colossus back together. Now the question was how to activate it. Numidium was originally meant to be powered by the heart of Lorkhan. How could one find a substitute for the heart of a god? Two stories tell different versions of what happened next. In the first, Zurin willingly sacrificed himself on Tibur's behalf, pouring his life force into a massive soul gem. In the second, Zurin and Tiber convinced Wulfharth Ash-King to return, on the promise they would destroy the Morrowind Tribunal together, but this turned out to be a trap, and instead, Wulfharth was ambushed, trapped, and his soul siphoned. Either way, the result was the same: the Mantella, a massive gem powered either by the essence of a mage with the soul of Magnus or an immortal king with the soul of Shor. With the Mantella, Tiber Septim was able to activate Numidium, and in the 896th year of the Second Era, a titan of cold brass blotted out the sun over the crystalline towers of Alinor. It is not known how exactly Tiber used the Numidium on the High Elves, only that he used it well. Utter devastation was wrought upon the Altmere, as the very fabric of time and space was sundered upon their sacred isle, causing chronological aftershocks which still impact the land to this day. The invasion of Alinor lasted an eternity and lasted an hour. Afterwards, the islands were annexed into the Empire. The Tiber Wars were over, for the dragon banner of the Third Empire now flew proudly over every nation and race of Tamriel. After the unification of Tamriel, the Second Era ended and the Third Era began. For the next 4 decades, the Dragon of the North reigned over a golden age of peace and prosperity in the land of Dawn's beauty. At least that is what the Imperial records would have us believe. In the 38th year of the Third Era, the man who had been born as Hergelti, raised as Talos, and crowned as Tiber Septim, passed away. So powerful was the spirit of this most extraordinary man, that when he shared his mortal form, he achieved apotheosis, godhood. Since the days of Alessia, the Imperials had worshipped a pantheon of 8 Adric deities. In death, Tiber Septim became the 9th, reborn as Talos, the god of war and governance. Meanwhile, the High Elves, believing themselves to be the descendants of the Aedra and their mortality a curse, looked on in horror as a member of their oldest rival, the race of men, achieved the divinity they so coveted. But all they could do for now was harbour their resentment. Tiber Septim's tenure had been one of peace and stability, but after his death, a series of incompetent emperors beget centuries of civil wars and rebellions, the most famous being the Wolf Queen Potema and Dread King Haemon Camoran of Valenwood. As a result, the Third Empire came upon the brink of collapsing entirely. But this was not to be, for a year after Haemon's collapse, a true warrior would ascend to the Ruby Throne, one who would turn the attention of Tamriel away from internal strife and revive the spirit of strength and conquest embodied in his ancestor Talos Stormcrown. In tenacity and ambition, Emperor Uriel Septim V truly was a worthy descendant of Tiber. Unlike the cloistered hedonists or meek puppets who had plagued the Septim bloodline for centuries, Uriel was more soldier than prince. In his eyes, the solution to the Empire's problems was simple. In order to put a stop to the endemic civil wars and insurrections plaguing the realm, a massive show of strength was needed, a grand expedition of conquest which would inspire fear and awe amongst the Empire's subjects. A grand concept, but what could Uriel V conquer? The entirety of Tamriel, which was basically the known world, was at least nominally under Septim rule. There were other continents on Nurn, but most were utterly undesirable. At Mora, the ancient homeland of the Nords, was by the Third Era an uninhabited chunk of ice. The ancient homeland of the Redguards, Yakuda, had ages ago been sunk into the sea. Overall, outside of Tamriel, Nurn had slim pickings. There was, however, one exception. The continent of Akavir, the mystic Far East, loomed large in Tamrielic folklore. Twice had peoples from that land invaded Tamriel, the first being the Seiski Snake Men, and the second being the Camel, a race of ostensible snow demons. The Seiski in particular had a massive impact on Tamrielic history, particularly in their supplication to Remen Cyrodiil, and subsequent pivotal role in building his Second Empire of Men. Yet in the Third Era, the Blades, the Septim Emperor's elite honor guard, still wore armor in the Akaviri style. Despite this, the people of Tamriel knew precious little about Akavir proper. Any information about its cultures and peoples came from the mad ramblings of the anonymous author of the book Mysterious Akavir, which on top of writing about the continent's native snake men and snow demons, also spanned tall tales of monkey folk, shape-shifting tiger men, and even dragons. The mystery surrounding Akavir would not deter Emperor Uriel's ambitions, but he nevertheless understood that this was not a project he could charge into blind. Before invading the Eastern Dragonland, he had to establish a network of outposts on the small islands that dotted the Sea of Ghosts and Padmaic Sea in order to maintain a supply line across the vast distance between Tamriel and his prize. So it was in 271 of the Third Era, an Imperial fleet, staffed by the 5th Legion, assembled at the Great Docks of Solitude, and from there made northeast for the small and frigid isle of Roscrea. After a 4-week journey, the Imperial Expedition Fleet landed on Roscrea's southeastern coast. Without delay, Uriel commanded the Legion engineers to begin construction of a port outpost town and fortress named Crane Shore and Fort Uriel respectively. Curiously, all this was done before any contact with the native islanders was made. The indigenous people of Roscrea were of the same stock as Skyrim's Nords. Like the Nords, they were descendants of migrants from the now frozen over Atmora, but unlike the Nords, they had remained fairly isolated on their island for millennia. So while their distant mainland cousins absorbed the cultural and religious influences of their Cyrodiilic neighbours, the Roscreans remained truer to their ancient Atmoran roots, albeit with their own unique island flair. One of these Atmoran traditions was their religious adherence to an animist pantheon of animal totems, such as the bear, the owl, and the whale. Warriors of these cults had long fought each other for dominance, tempering the Roscreans into a fierce, battle-hardened people. However, by far the most hated cult on the island was the dragon cult. Just like in Skyrim, dragons had once ruled over men on Roscrea, but both they and their sycophantic human worshippers had been driven off the island by bear cult berserkers long ago. However, the Roscreans had long memories, so when a foreign navy landed on their shores waving the proud dragon banner that represented their emperor's ties to the most holy Akatosh, the Roscreans prepared to repulse the intrusion of what they assumed were their ancient foes. During the month of Second Seed, a large warband of bear cult warriors, led by their chief Gunda Whitebear, fell upon the natal settlement of Crane Shore, massacring its inhabitants. Having had little contact with the natives thus far, the Imperial soldiers and labourers there were taken completely by surprise. This attack, known in Septimite records as the Sack of Crane Shore, launched the beginning of the war between the Red Legion and the descendants of Ross. Predictably, the Empire responded to provocation with swift brutality. From Fort Uriel, the Emperor appointed his general Didymos to lead half the 5th Legion to the native mining town of Stonval. The bear cultists there held firm, defending the steep valley passes leading into the town fiercely, but the Imperials eventually broke through and repaid the Sack of Crane Shore with a sack of their own. Nevertheless, it was a costly victory, as for every Roscrean slain, 12 legionnaires had fallen. While this occurred, Uriel deployed the Imperial fleet to subdue the island's coastal settlements. The fishing town of Vengult was home to the island's whale cult, which had long been oppressed by the dominant bear cult. So when the Red Navy arrived, Vengult threw open its harbour and welcomed them as liberators, something they later regretted when they realized the Imperials cared not for the cult allegiances of the natives and saw them all as enemies. The dragon-bannered ships then sailed on to Eindur, which met a similar fate and submitted to Imperial authority. These coastal conquests isolated the settlement of Frolthul, the capital of the bear cult. Situated deep in the island's northwestern mountains and well fortified by Atmoran stoneworks, Frolthul would be a tough nut to crack. The 5th Legion's numbers were already dangerously thinned out after the battle for Stonval, and General Didymos was unwilling to risk losing thousands more attacking an incredibly well-defended enemy position. So instead, he ordered the construction of Fort Severus to control the Stonval Pass, the only mountain corridor that connected Frulthul to the island's fertile southeastern lowlands, isolating the bear cult warriors by land while the Imperial Navy cut off their access to the sea. For 3 months, a tense standoff ensued, as despite their encirclement, the chief Gundar and his bear cult warriors refused to surrender. Native marauders launched regular sorties out of Frulthul, striking often at Stonval, which changed hands multiple times. Knowing the terrain far better than the legionaries, the Rosgrians were able to harry isolated Imperial foraging parties, patrols and scouts with relative impunity. Winter was soon approaching, and Emperor Uriel was growing frustrated. He was losing too many men and resources over a relatively insignificant island, whose only use was as a backwater supply port. This had to end. To that end, he turned to the missionary, Cato of Skingrad, one of the few Imperials who had built rapport with the natives by taking the time to learn the Rosgrian language and customs. Under Cato's purview, a treaty was agreed to between the Emperor and Chief Gundar. Per its provisions, the island's southeastern lowlands between Fort Uriel, Crane Shore and Fort Severus would be ceded into direct Imperial control, while the Imperials would recognize the bear cult's ultimate supremacy over the rest of the island. Rosgria had been subdued, and the first supply outpost between Tamriel and Akavir had been secured. In later Imperial records, the conquest of Rosgria would be reduced to a single footnote in the historical record, but at the time it was an important development of Uriel V's ambitions, for it gave his army well-needed battle experience for the campaigns to come. The Far East awaited. It would take another 17 years for the Emperor and his armada to actually make it to Akavir, as Uriel spent the better part of 2 decades conquering the other small islands of the Padamaic Sea and establishing functioning supply ports to support his eventual Akaviri conquest. The mysterious isles of Cathnaqui and Ineslia were subsumed into Septim control in 3rd Era 276 and 279 respectively. Then in 284, Imperial forces conquered Black Harbour on the spice island of Esrienet. After subduing Esrienet, the Emperor's full attention could be devoted to planning for the Akaviri Campaign. Naval expeditions were dispatched in 285 and 286 to scout the sea lanes and coastlands of Akavir, and various Imperial intelligence agents, both magical and mundane, were employed to gather information. On the basis of all this information, the kingdom of the Seiski in the southwest of Akavir was selected as the initial target for the invasion. In the Imperial University, heated debates have often broken out over who or what the Seiski were. The book Mysterious Akavir depicts them as vampiric serpent people who ate the native men of Akavir, while surviving depictions of the Seiski who served Remen in the Second Era suggests they were the men of Akavir. It is also possible the Seiski were a nation of men ruled by a serpentine elite, and eaten is a misinterpretation of the Akaviri word for conquered. Or the Seiski serpents were shapeshifters, capable of taking on a humanoid form. In any case, they were deadly warriors, known especially as dragon hunters. As the old Dover Parthenax attested, the Seiski were responsible for wiping out most of his kind. Uriel had a tough fight ahead of him. On the 23rd of Rain's Hand, 288, an Imperial invasion armada departed from Black Harbour, staffed by the 5th, 7th, 10th and 14th Legions. After a 6-week journey, his army made landfall in Akavir at the mouth of a large and fertile river valley. There they found a small Seiski town which had been completely abandoned. The town was annexed and renamed Septimia, the first colony of the new Imperial province of Akavir. After fortifying Septimia and expanding its docks, 2 of the 4 legions continued inland along the river, seeing fertile yet abandoned farmlands along the way. Before long, they came upon another settlement, also a ghost town. They named this town Ionith, and because it was much bigger than Septimia, and better suited to dominate the surrounding countryside, Emperor Uriel set up his base of operations there. So far, all had gone well. The Seyski had fled rather than put up a fight, and as a result, the Empire had a foothold in Akavir. Things were going so well, in fact, that the Imperials began to let their guard down. 2 legions, the 9th and 17th, were still in Esroniet awaiting transport to Akavir, but due to the lack of resistance, the Emperor decided their support was unnecessary, and instead used the limited capacity of the Imperial fleet to transport civilian colonists to Septimia and Ionith to farm the fields the natives had abandoned. However, as it turned out, the Seyski were not fleeing, but observing. As the Imperials had advanced, mounted patrols had shadowed them all the while, and now began repeatedly harrying Imperial scouting patrols and frustrating efforts to build a road between Septimia and Ionith. As his navy had been incapable of transporting any horses, Uriel's soldiers were incapable of striking back against these Seyski Sepahis, who were faster and knew the terrain better. Soon, however, cavalry mounts arrived via boat from Esrionit, and the Seyski raids were effectively stymied. Afterwards, Snake Men emissaries arrived in Ionith under a banner of diplomacy. A manner of truce was reached, and the legions and colonists settled in for the coming winter. Winter, as it turned out, brought nothing but suffering upon the invaders. A frigid sea storm prevented the Imperial fleet from making further landfall, depriving the expeditionary force of much-needed supplies and provisions. On the 5th of Sun's Dawn, a procession of Seyski envoys arrived at Ionith claiming to bear surrender from their king, only to prove treacherous, murdering the guards at the city gates and allowing in a large force which made a beeline for Uriel's palace with the aim of assassinating the Emperor, but were repulsed by the valiant efforts of the 10th Legion. Spring brought no reprieve. When the Imperial fleet finally arrived, it was a tattered remnant, much of it having been lost to the capricious storms on the Padmaic Sea. The expeditionary force had begun to starve, and the local farms would prove no help either. Throughout spring and into summer, terrible scorching winds blew in from the east, drying up the farmlands and turning the river into mud. To this day, Imperial scholars debate whether or not these repeated natural disasters were natural Akaviri weather patterns, or the result of powerful Seyski sorcerers wielding some form of unknown magic to starve out their foes. It is also here that the fate of the expeditionary force becomes more obscure, as the Imperial battle mages, charged with maintaining communication lines from Tamriel, had to be put aboard the Imperial fleet, using their arcane talents to protect the ships from the constant ocean storms in a desperate final attempt to resupply the expedition by sea. In late 289, the Red Fleet had arrived safely back to Black Harbour, thanks to the Battle Mage Corps, but all attempts to return to Akavir were frustrated by a series of ever more savage storms that battered Esroniet. By the end of the year, the Imperial legions in Ionith and Septimia were starving, ragged and demoralized. In the middle of the month of Sun's Height, some Imperial scouts were apparently able to confirm that a large Seyski army had begun massing on the other side of a mountain range to the north. The Snake Men, it seemed, had successfully played the long game. Uriel knew full well that to remain sheltered in Ionith was to die a slow death, so he initiated a Hail Mary. With the full force of what remained of all 4 legions, the Emperor marched out of the outpost in the middle of the month of Sun's Height, leaving only small garrisons to hold the 2 cities. Evidently, the Seyski were not expecting their beleaguered foes to have the will to scale mountains to face them. So when Uriel's legionaries descended upon the lowlands of North Snakeland, they were able to find a large encampment of Seyski warriors and rout them. However, reinforcements soon arrived, pouring out of surrounding hills and forests, and before long, Uriel found himself highly outnumbered and in danger of total encirclement. With no other choice, he was forced to retreat back to Ionith, harassed by Seyski horsemen the entire time, who inflicted heavy casualties upon their foes. A rump force made it back to Ionith, and the Seyski laid siege to both colonial outposts. By now, The best outcome was withdrawal. Victory was now truly out of Uriel's grasp, but some of the Imperial fleet had broken through the storms and was en route to Septimia to evacuate the survivors. For all his hubris, it cannot be said that the Emperor was without honor or integrity. In the month of Evening Star, he rallied the remnants of the 10th Legion, and together they led a fierce sortie out of Ionith, formed a shield wall, and engaged the far larger Seyski foe. This bought enough time for the other legions to retreat back to Septimia. By the time the Imperial fleet arrived in Septimia, the city was under heavy Seyski assault. The battle mages aboard the ships were able to repel the attackers long enough for the ragged remnant of Uriel's once mighty Akaviri expedition force to board. Among the survivors were 2 members of the 10th Legion, who confirmed what many already feared. Uriel V had fallen in battle. The Imperial conquest of Akavir was officially lost. Had fate played out differently for Uriel Septim V, he may have been an emperor equal to the mighty Talos. As it is, he is afforded a mixed legacy in the Imperial records, depicted both as the Septim Empire's second best warrior king, but also as a man who charged far too readily into the unknown and met with calamity as a result. Nevertheless, Uriel V's reign was not without its successes. His thorough and meticulous approach to military consolidation had managed to bring relative stability to Tamriel, calming the constant insurrections and civil wars that had plagued it before his reign, and while Akavir had eluded his grasp, his smaller acquisitions, like Roscria, remained in Imperial hands for generations to come. Despite its calamitous end on the distant shores of Akavir, the reign of Uriel V had a relatively stabilizing effect on the Third Empire. The late emperor's successors, Uriel VI, Murihatha, and Pelagius IV, ruled over a relatively peaceful Tamriel. However, when Pelagius IV was succeeded by his son, Uriel VII, trouble would return to the realm once more. More than any emperor before him, Uriel VII's tenure was defined by interactions with a procession of nameless, faceless heroes who time and again helped him restore order and justice to the realm. In the early days of Uriel's reign, he relied heavily on the counsel of his battle mage, Yeager Tharn. Under Yeager's guidance, the young emperor was able to strengthen imperial control over the troublesome eastern provinces, most notably by assimilating the Dunmer Great House of Halalu, and using them as a spearhead to spread imperial culture throughout Morrowind. However, as Uriel's skill in statecraft began to outpace his advisor, Yeager began to fear that his usefulness to the emperor would run dry. In a bid to preserve his position of power, the battle mage used a sordid artifact known as the Staff of Chaos to imprison Uriel in a realm of oblivion, using illusion magic to impersonate the emperor himself and continue to rule in his place. Under Yeager's neglectful rule, the unity of Tamriel began to shatter. The Dark Elves and Argonians clashed in the Arnesian War, while Skyrim violently annexed territories in eastern High Rock and Hammerfell, and the Khajiit and Bosmer fought a territorial border skirmish in their dense native forests. This era of chaos, known as the Simulacrum, was ended when one of those aforementioned faceless heroes, known simply as the Eternal Champion, revealed Tharn's deception, defeated him, rescued Uriel from oblivion, and restored the rightful emperor to the throne. Remarkably, the emperor was able to stabilize his realm once more, mainly through use of the blades. On top of being the emperor's honor guard, the elite warriors descended from Reman's Akaviri Dragon Guard now also operated as covert agents throughout the provinces, restoring order through clever political subterfuge. One of these agents was the second of Uriel's nameless heroes, the Champion of Daggerfall. When Tiber Septim's erstwhile brass god, the Numidium, resurfaced in Iliac Bay, this champion navigated the complex political waters of the region to ensure that not only would the Big Walker of the Dwemer finally disappear from Nurn and cause no more chaos, but that the highly fractured petty kingdoms of High Rock became more unified and loyal to the Empire than ever before. Of course, while the Emperor was putting out fires in the west, new ones had lit up in the east. In 3E427, pillars of ash plumed from Red Mountain, choking the air, while a virulent plague, known as Corpus, infected highborn and low alike. The powers of Vivek, Almalexia and Sotha Sil, the Divine Tribunal, were weakening. Before the Tribunal were gods, they had been mere advisors to the great Chimera lord Indoril Nerevar, but had betrayed and murdered him in order to usurp the lost heart of Tamriel's creator god, through which they became gods themselves. As Morrowind choked, Emperor Uriel VII found a prisoner in the Imperial City dungeons, released him, and sent him to the ancient Dunmer homeland. Uriel knew that this prisoner was the Nerevarine, the reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar, destined to restore balance in the east. It is unknown how the Emperor identified this hero of fate, but sure enough, the Nerevarine served his purpose. When he found the heart of Lorkhan beneath Red Mountain, cast it from the mortal realm, and in so doing, ended not only the plague-choking Morrowind, but also the divinity of the Tribunal, which had ruled it for thousands of years. The situation in Morrowind had been stabilized, but in 3E433, the largest and final crisis would loom its ugly head. It is here that we must take a brief moment to discuss the life and times of a man with a dream of creating paradise, Mankar Camoran. Mankar's father was Haemon, a royal pretender, who during the imperial reign of Sepphoris Septim II had usurped the Bosmeri throne from King Kaltos Camoran and used the Wood Elf armies at his disposal to launch a devastating invasion across western Tamriel. The usurper's dread crusade was halted by the United Bretons of High Rock in 3E267. However, his pregnant mistress, a Bosmer named Kalis, fled into the wilderness of Dwinnen, where she gave birth to his son, Mankar. Much of Mankar's life is shrouded in mystery. Even his appearance is an enigma, for despite being ostensibly born of Wood Elf stock, his adult body took on a distinctly High Elf form. What is known is that, like his father Haemon, who was said to summon demons from Oblivion to fight for him, Mankar developed an affinity for the Daedra. At some point, he was chosen by Marunes Dagon, the Daedric Prince of Destruction. Marunes gifted his devout servant with the Mysterium Xaxes, a book so vile and corrupting to mortals that even handling it was said to drive them mad. Mankar was no exception, for he became lost in the prophecies and poetry written in the Xaxes, and through it created a new, insane vision for the world. Mankar came to believe that Mundus, the mortal realm upon which Tamriel sat, was not the nexus of creation as many believed. Indeed, Lorkhan, the Ur-god who had created the earth, was in fact just another Daedric prince, and Tamriel was just another Daedric realm. Therefore, when the Aedra had ripped the heart from Lorkhan's body and trapped it under Red Mountain, they had essentially usurped Tamriel from its rightful Daedric owners. Therefore, Mankar had a sacred duty to help the Daedric Prince of Destruction reclaim the birthright of his kind. With the power afforded to him by the Mysterium Xaxes, Mankar slowly drew in mortals from across Tamriel to join in a secret cult, the Mythic Dawn. Then, he set in motion his plans. On the 27th of last seed, 3E433, catastrophe struck the Empire as Geldol Septim, Enman Septim, and Ebel Septim, the sons of the Emperor, were simultaneously assassinated by the mysterious cult of the Mythic Dawn. Reeling in shock, a contingent of Blades immediately sought to spirit the Emperor out of the Imperial City to safety through a secret underground route leading past the Imperial prisons. There, the escape party happened upon an unknown prisoner, the last of Uriel's heroes. Recognizing the mysterious inmate as a face from his dreams, Uriel entrusted the prisoner with the Amulet of Kings, and charged him to deliver it safely into the hands of Joffrey, Grand Master of the Blades. The Emperor would be cut down by Mythic Dawn agents moments later. Ever since Akatosh had gifted the Amulet of Kings to Queen Alessia thousands of years ago, Tamriel had been shielded from the wrath of the Daedra, and while powerful conjurers could summon Daedra into the realm, the princes of Oblivion could not invade Tamriel of their own volition. Now, the pact between Akatosh and the Dragonborn rulers of Man had been severed. Across Tamriel, Oblivion gates opened up, and from their dreadful maws, hordes of Dremora poured forth. The Oblivion Crisis had begun. The nameless prisoner ventured to Waynan Priory, where he delivered the Amulet of Kings into Joffrey's care. There, the Grand Master of the Blades informed them that the only way to stop the invasion was to have a Dragonborn prince relight the dragonfires in the Temple of the One while wearing the Amulet of Kings, thereby restoring the covenant with Akatosh. The problem was, the Dragonborn line ran through the blood of the Septims, and the Septims had all been assassinated, all the legitimate ones in any case. In the city of Kovach lived a man named Martin, a priest of the Nine Divines, completely unaware of his true parentage. In him, the salvation of Tamriel now lay. They arrived too late, for Kovach was already in flames. A massive Oblivion gate had opened just outside the city's main gate. Hordes of Daedra had poured forth, taking the city guard completely by surprise and laying waste to the town. Here, Uriel's chosen prisoner entered through the Oblivion gate, closing it from within, stymieing the Dremoric menace and earning himself a new epithet, the Hero of Kovach. During the chaos, a young priest had ferried many civilians into the Chapel of Akatosh, sheltering them from the hellfire and saving their lives. There, the Hero of Kovach found him amongst a crowd of survivors. At first, young Martin was hesitant to accept the gravity of his destiny. However, he eventually agreed to go back with the hero to Waynan Priory. Nevertheless, the Mythic Dawn remained one step ahead of them, for upon their return, assassins of the cult had already struck and made off with the Amulet of Kings. Despite this setback, Martin, Joffrey and the hero made their way to the ancient Akaviri stronghold of Cloud Ruler Temple, ancestral stronghold of the Blades. There, the Dragon Guard, whose ancestors had once served Remen Cyrodiil, now declared this new bastard priest to be Martin Septim, the rightful Dragonborn Emperor of Tamriel. Meanwhile, gates continued to open throughout the continent, heralding misery and destruction wherever they manifested into being. The situation was particularly tragic in Alinor. Nestled in the heart of the ancient High Elf homeland was the Crystal Tower, one of the oldest structures in Tamriel, which alongside the Adamantine Tower in Balfiera and the White Gold Tower in High Rock, made up the primordial pillars that stabilized the fabric of the mortal world. When Oblivion gates opened across Somerset, countless Altmer fled to their beloved tower, believing its ancient magics would protect them from the Daedra. This was to no avail, for the infernal servants of Dagon conjured massive tremors, which collapsed the most important monument in Elvendom and killed the thousands of souls inside. Meanwhile, things were going about as poorly in the east. Although still reeling from the disappearance of the Tribunal, the Dunmer put up a vicious fight against the Dremora host. The city of Uldrune was an ancient stronghold, built inside the carcass of a long-dead colossal Emperor Crab. When Marunis' horde descended upon the city, the great wizards of House Redoran reanimated the massive crustacean, essentially making their very city fight for them. A valiant effort, but to no avail, for Uldrune fell all the same, and the Dunmer were massacred. Not every province in Tamriel was caught on the back foot. The Argonians of Black Marsh were a people bound to the Hist, a species of massive, hyper-intelligent primordial trees who created the lizard folk and maintained a telepathic link with them. With infinite foresight, the Hist foresaw the Oblivion Crisis before it happened. Through the tree's sacred sap, the Argonians were made stronger, faster, and able to endure endless pain. Thus, when the Oblivion gates opened in Black Marsh, the lizardmen poured right into them, invading the invaders themselves with such merciless fury that Dagon's lieutenants had to close the gates in that region to stop themselves from being overrun. Back in Cyrodiil, Martin Septim, the Blades, and the hero of Kovach had begun the first steps in their plan to end the infernal invasion for good. After some investigative work, the hero managed to disguise themselves as a member of the Mythic Dawn and infiltrate one of their secret meetings. There they encountered Mankar Camoran, but before the hero could reclaim the amulet, Mankar escaped into Oblivion through a portal. This time, however, the side of good had something to show for their efforts, for Mankar had left behind something important, the Mysterium Xarxes. Through the very examination of Dagon's infernal tome, Martin deduced that he could reopen a portal directly to Mankar's location in Oblivion with the help of 3 artifacts, a Daedric artifact, a Great Welkind Stone, and the Blood of the Divines. These tasks were entrusted to the hero of Kovach. Finding an artifact of one of the Daedric princes came first, although the histories are unclear which prince's object of power was sacrificed. Next came the Great Welkind Stone, which the hero found in the ancient Ayleid ruins of Miskakend, a remnant of the last time Daedra had walked freely on Tamriel under the patronage of depraved Ayleid princes. Finally, the Blood of the Divines was obtained through a comic loophole. In the ancient ruins of Sankrator, where dragonborn emperors had been buried since the days of Alesia, was interred the armor of Tiber Septim, where still remained the residue of blood from when the mortal who became a god was still a man. Unfortunately, even with all 3 relics acquired, one more was needed before a portal could be opened to Mankar, a great sigil stone, the anchor to the largest of the Oblivion gates. Thus, Martin made the risky decision to allow a great gate to open outside the city of Bruma, enabling the Daedra to launch a full invasion of the city. The battle outside Bruma was brutal, with soldiers from across Cyrodiil clashing with the endless Dremora host, and Emperor Martin, donned in the armor of his forefather Talos, at the head of the fray. As the melee raged, the hero of Kovach dove into the Great Gate, seizing its sigil stone and closing the portal. Bruma was saved. Finally, a portal could be opened directly to Mankar Camoran's location, and thus the hero of Kovach journeyed through it and entered into Gaia Alata, a small slice of Oblivion created by Mankar himself, a reflection of the paradise he would create whence Tamriel had been purified by its rightful Daedric owners. But Mankar's paradise was an illusion, the delusional dream of a deranged madman, and finally, the hero chosen by Uriel VII in the Imperial prison cut down the insane assassin of emperors and recovered the Amulet of Kings. With the amulet back in their possession, Martin and the hero rushed for the Imperial city, where they intended to relight the dragonfires and restore the Covenant of Akatosh. But once again, they were too late. With his chief servant dead, Marunis Dagon had launched a last-ditch all-out assault upon the Imperial city, in which he personally led the charge as a massive, nigh invulnerable avatar of himself. The Veil of Oblivion was torn, the dragonfires rendered useless, and Dagon himself stood in the heart of Tamriel, intent on its distraction. After he and the hero fought their way to the Temple of the One, Martin acknowledged the futility of renewing the old Pact of Akatosh. It would not banish Dagon now that his physical form walked freely upon the mortal plane. Now, only the greatest sacrifice would close shut the jaws of Oblivion. So it was that Emperor Martin, the last of the line of Septim, shattered the Amulet of Kings, transforming himself into an avatar of Akatosh, and handily defeating Dagon in the form of that great golden dragon, before eternally committing his mortal soul to the divine. The Oblivion Crisis was over. It was a bittersweet victory. With Martin's sacrifice, no Daedric prince could ever again invade the realm. However, with his death, the Septim line was now extinct, and the descendants of Talos Stormcrown no more. Greatly weakened by Dagon's invasion, and now without its ruling dynasty, the empire began to disintegrate. It was here, at this weakest point, that what remained of Tiber Septim's realm would face its greatest foe. Deep in Alinor, a faction of Altmer had begun the process of seizing power, with the intent of reclaiming their ancestral lands and taking their revenge on the empire that had once laid them so low. The sun was setting on the Age of Men, and with the new dawn came a new Merethic age. The Great Thalmor War loomed on the horizon. At the dawn of the new Fourth Era, there was no emperor on the throne, and a massive power vacuum threw Cyrodiil into political chaos. For the province of Morrowind, this could not have come at a worse time. Back in the Second Era, a small meteor from Oblivion called Bardau had come careening down onto Vvardenfell's largest urban centre, Vivec City. Vivec, the city's namesake and one of Morrowind's 3 living gods, stopped the meteor and kept it frozen above his city in suspended animation. However, when Vivec disappeared alongside the rest of the tribunal right before the Oblivion Crisis, Bardau became unstable, and in the 5th year of the Fourth Era resumed its descent with all its original velocity. This caused a catastrophic shockwave throughout Vvardenfell, which triggered a massive apocalyptic eruption in Red Mountain. Vast swaths of Morrowind were rendered uninhabitable, choked in a sea of ash. As the Dunmer were left wondering why their gods had forsaken them, it got worse. Long had the Argonians of Black Marsh been the victims of Dark Elf slavers, and now, emboldened by their decisive victory over Dagon's hordes during the Oblivion Crisis, they decided to take their revenge on their former masters. Led by a nativist faction called the Ancellil, the lizard folk poured into southern Morrowind, repaying 1,000 years of indignity with rivers of blood. It is unclear how much territory the Argonians managed to capture. Either way, the Empire was unable to handle that hot potato while dealing with its crises closer to home, while Black Marsh, now led by the anti-colonial Ancellil faction, broke away as well, with Cyrodiil able to do little to stop them. As a result, the East was lost to the Empire. In year 10 of the Fourth Era, High Chancellor Akato of the Elder Council, serving as a regent in place of an emperor, was assassinated, and the political crisis in Cyrodiil escalated into a bloodbath as warlords across the Heartland province battled for control over the Ruby Throne. This chaotic battle royale ended in year 17 of the Fourth Era, when a ragged Colovian general named Titus Mede captured the imperial city and restored unity to what was left of the empire. Although incomparable to the Dragonborn emperors of old, Titus Mede I was a decent ruler and a pragmatic military leader, but his reign would be fraught with yet more crises beyond his control, as a new threat arose in the Mirish West, the Thalmor. Throughout the provinces of Man, the Thalmor are seen as cartoonishly evil villains, hell-bent on racially motivated world domination, and there is certainly truth to that. Nevertheless, it is necessary to understand the Thalmor mindset, and how such an extremist faction was allowed to foment within High Elven society. During the Empire's heyday, there were always Altmer who resented being ruled over by men, and who had never forgiven the death and destruction that Tiber Septim had wrought unto them when he unleashed the brass god Numidium upon their beloved isles. This resentment was amplified by the fact that Tiber Septim had become a god for his troubles, salt in the wound which was extra coarse because at its core, Altmer philosophy believed the Elves to be the true descendants of the Aedra. Ultimately, as enlightened and cosmopolitan as the Septim Empire ostensibly was, it had broken the Elves into submission through fire and blood, and the Elves, a long-lived people, had equally long memories. The Thalmor had always existed as a political party in the Somerset Isles, but during the glory days of the Empire, they had always been a minority voice. However, the Oblivion Crisis gave them an opportunity to rise to power in a meteoric fashion. During the invasion, as the Imperial City was in chaos, pro-Imperial factions in the Somerset Isles were forced to give the Thalmor high authority to fight off the Daedric horde. Evidently, the Thalmor proved to be fine leaders, for despite the catastrophic destruction of the Crystal Tower, They were fairly successful in driving off the demonic advance. Of course, after Maruna's Dagon was banished from Mundus, the Thalmor kept their emergency powers and in the year 22 seized control of the Somerset Isles, rebranding it as Alinor, the name it had once had before Tiber's conquests. Almost immediately afterwards, the Thalmor jumped across the pond to seize the lands of their elven cousins, the Bosmer. The fall of Valenwood, which occurred in year 29, was likely an inside job. Certain powerful Wood Elf clans within the floating trees of Falinesti were already closely tied to the Thalmor even before the Oblivion Crisis, and appear to have opened the door to Ifri's ancient forest for them. With the two elven sister provinces of the southwest reunited, the Altmeri Dominion, a kingdom which had not existed since the Second Era, was reborn. For the next 70 years, the Thalmor bided their time and consolidated their gains. The next avenue for expansion occurred 70 years later, not that long a time by Altmer standards. In 98, Nirn's two moons, Massa and Secunda, vanished from the skies. The reasons for this are unknown, but it was an absolute catastrophe for the Khajiit of elsewhere, for the moons were central to their religion and determined which of the many Khajiiti forms their children would be born in. Thankfully, the moons returned 2 years later, with the Thalmor taking credit for their restoration. Scholars today still debate whether or not this was true, or a clever bit of Dominion propaganda. But either way, enough Khajiit believed it, so in 115, the Thalmor easily launched a coup to take control over the whole province, splitting it in two by reviving the old borders of the ancient kingdoms of Aniquina and Palatine. The Altmeri Dominion were now the undisputed masters of southern Tamriel, and about as powerful as their predecessor state, the Old Dominion, had been during the interregnum of the Second Era. In contrast, when Titus Mede II ascended to the throne in 168, he inherited an empire half the size it had once been. Only the human provinces remained, and even among them, Hammerfell had fallen back into old habits, as the Crown and forebear factions of the Redguards had begun fighting amongst themselves again. Titus Mede II was a decently capable ruler, but he was no legend like Alessia, Remen or Tiber, but a normal man who would be stretched to his limits in the impending war to come. On the 30th of Frostfall, in the 171st year of the Fourth Era, a tall, golden-skinned ambassador of the Altmeri Dominion drove a covered cart through the gates of the imperial city, bearing gifts for the emperor. However, when given an audience, he dropped the pretense of diplomatic parlance and delivered an ultimatum. The empire was to disband the secret service of the Blades, become a tributary state to the Altmeri Dominion, cede large parts of Hammerfell into Dominion hands, and, in what would later become the most controversial demand of all, completely outlaw the worship of Talos, the man-turned-god. These demands were absolutely outrageous, and as expected, the Emperor immediately rejected them. Evidently having expected this, the haughty elven ambassador kicked his covered cart onto its side, allowing the gift he had brought to roll onto the floor. 100 severed heads, every Imperial Blades agent who had been secretly operating in Alinor and Valenwood. Immediately, the Empire scrambled to mobilize its legions, but their enemy was many steps ahead of them. For months, the Dominion had been mobilizing their forces in secret. From hidden camps in the jungles of elsewhere, a mighty host, commanded by the Thalmor general Lord Narufin, marched essentially unopposed into southern Cyrodiil. Leowyn fell within days, and Bravil was isolated and besieged shortly afterwards. Simultaneously, another Altmeri force, led by one Lady Arenelia, launched a two-pronged assault from the west. Elven Marines landed on the southern coastline of Hammerfell, while the main body of her troops pushed the hastily assembled and ill-prepared legions on the Valenwood border backwards. The Imperials put up a dogged but futile resistance as elven battle mages made an interminable advance through Colovia. When Arenelia's main force managed to link up with her marines on the coast, the legions were forced to disengage, withdrawing north through the Alikir Desert in what would later become known as the March of Thirst. Meanwhile, native resistance in Hammerfell was piecemeal at best, as infighting between Redguard factions had rendered the defensive capabilities of that proud warrior race inert. Soon, the entirety of western Hammerfell, save for Hagathe, fell into Thalmor hands. In 172, Anvil fell to Lady Arenelia, who then redoubled her efforts to seize the stubbornly defiant city of Hagathe. Meanwhile, Lord Narafin's expeditionary force finally captured Bravil. Co-opting the city's substantial merchant fleet, Narafin ferried his troops across the Nibben River and began advancing up its east bank. While fresh legions from Skyrim were deployed south to hold the line, they were only able to delay the Thalmor advance. In Cyrodiil, the Empire was fighting a war of attrition in which they were slowly losing ground. In Hammerfell, however, the sands began to shift when an army of forebears broke the siege of Hagathe. Hagathe was a crown city, and the cooperation the two rival factions displayed against a common enemy led to the reunification of the Redguard people. Meanwhile, the surviving legionaries from the March of Thirst regrouped near Dragonstar, where they were reinforced by fresh legions from High Rock, led by one General Decianus. As native resistance in Hammerfell thusly intensified, Decianus saw his chance and ordered an advance. The two armies clashed at the city of Skaven in a brutal battle in which both sides took heavy casualties. This effectively rendered the Hammerfell theatre of the war into a stalemate, as Decianus' legions no longer had the manpower to push deeper into the province, while the Thalmor's losses had weakened their hold on their occupied territories significantly. The setbacks in Hammerfell made Altmeri leadership grimly aware that the longer the war went on, the more unstable things could become for them. Thus, they cast the proverbial die and committed all their available forces into an all-or-nothing assault on the Imperial city, hoping that in doing so, they could force a surrender and end the war once and for all. By 4E 174, the city was surrounded by gold-plated elven battle mages in all directions. Emperor Titus Mede II knew the city was doomed to fall. What legions he had in the city and the hinterlands beyond were desperately outnumbered, and while reinforcements from Skyrim were on the way, they would not arrive in time to relieve the city. Heavy is the head who wears the crown, for Titus was thus forced to make a hard decision: to flee the city. As the Thalmor launched their attack, sending all manner of deadly arcane magics crashing into the gilded streets of the capital, the 8th Legion fought a desperate and suicidal rearguard action along the city's southern and western walls. Meanwhile, Emperor Titus made a ferocious charge from the northern gates, breaking through the Altmeri forces stationed there and linking up with the Skyrim legions in Bruma, where they retreated through Pale Pass to relative safety in Skyrim. The Emperor would live on to fight another day, but his city came under the total military occupation of Lord Narafin and his Thalmor Justicars. In the following days, the Imperial Palace was burned, the White Gold Tower itself looted, and all manner of atrocities were carried out by the vengeful elves on the innocent populace. By the winter of 174, all of Cyrodiil, save for the counties of Bruma and Cheydinhal, had more or less fallen into Altmeri hands. With the imperial capital captured and the emperor in exile, the Thalmor expected Titus to begin overtures for surrender, an assumption that the emperor deliberately fed credence to, all while he mustered his forces for one final desperate bid to save his empire, the Battle of the Red Ring. In early 4E 175, Titus II began mobilizing all his remaining soldiery into 3 separate army groups in the hinterlands of Cyrodiil. The Skyrim legions, composed principally of Nord warriors and led by one General Yona, were deployed southeast to Cheydinhal, while the Cyrodiil legions who had escaped the fall of the imperial city amassed in Bruma under the personal leadership of the Emperor himself. Meanwhile, General Decianus, still holding the line in eastern Hammerfell, was ordered to retreat to a hidden position near Chorrol and await further orders to advance on the capital. Decianus obeyed, but unwilling to abandon Hammerfell to Lady Arenelia's tyrannies, he discharged a large number of quote-unquote invalids from his legions before he left. Remarkably, without the aid of the Imperial Army regulars, the hardened Legion veterans Decianus left behind managed to link up with the native Redguard resistance and broke the deadlock with Arenelia, pushing her forces slowly back to the coast. Meanwhile, in Cyrodiil, the final fight began. On the 30th of Rain's Hand, the armies of Decianus poured forth from their hidden positions in the hills of Chorrol. Lord Narifin, who had been fed bad intelligence that Decianus was still in Hammerfell, was taken by surprise. For once, the Thalmor were the ones on the back foot, and the veteran legionaries of the Alakir Theatre were able to break through the Altmeri lines, driving eastward down the titular Red Ring Road towards the western bank of Lake Remer. From the east, General Iona's Nords encountered fiercer resistance as they made a westward plunge to link up with Decianus's forces. However, despite being faced with dogged resistance from the Thalmor garrisons in Bravil and Skingrad, the sons and daughters of Skyrim broke through, reaching the Red Ring Road from the east as Decianus's forces secured the west, effectively encircling the Imperial city and the Altmeri garrison within. While the largest Thalmor armies in Cyrodiil were encircled, slaughtered, and driven into the Imperial city, the coup de grace came from the north, as Titus Mede II personally led a final, all-or-nothing assault to break the Elven army's resolve. Rather than weather a siege from behind the city walls, Lord Narifin bet the proverbial farm, sallying out across Lake Remer to meet the Emperor on the open field. This gamble would cost him everything, for the Emperor's ragged and battle-hardened legionaries smashed through his Justicars, with Titus himself allegedly wielding the legendary sword Goldbrand, personally capturing Narifin. With their leader now lost, the morale of the remaining Altmeri forces within the city collapsed, and they tried to abandon it via the south gate, only to be blocked in by Iona's Nordic legions and cut down to the last. The Battle of the Red Ring was over, and the Thalmor army occupying Cyrodiil had been all but annihilated, and for now the Empire was saved. Following the battle, Lord Narifin was hanged from the White Gold Tower. There he dangled for 33 days, with some stories claiming that on the 34th, a winged Daedra carried him off. For the Empire, the triumph at the Red Ring was, at best, a Pyrrhic victory. Despite having retaken Cyrodiil, the war had left the Imperial state severely weakened. 3 entire legions had been completely wiped out, while the rest were operating at less than half their total manpower. In his heart, Titus Mede II was a soldier, but he knew his realm was in no state to continue fighting an indefinite, expensive war of attrition against a foe who had an unknown amount of manpower still in reserve. Thus, he sued for peace. In autumn of 175, the Empire and the Altmeri Dominion signed the White Gold Concordat, officially bringing the Great War to an end. It was a treaty heavily skewed in favour of the Thalmor, for they received much of the demands in their original ultimatum, including the cessation of southern Hammerfell and the outlawing of the worship of Talos. To many critics within the Empire, this made Emperor Titus's decision to fight the war in the first place pointless. However, it should be considered that had the Emperor accepted the Thalmor's original ultimatum back in 171, when the Empire was at full strength, he would have had a civil war on his hands. Whereas now, with the Empire in a state of utter exhaustion, most everyone welcomed peace, no matter how humiliating the price. Peace, however, proved to be no reprieve for the anemic remains of Tiber Septim's once great Imperium. The Red Guards of Hammerfell had been fighting long and brutally against the Altmeri forces in their lands, and understandably felt utterly betrayed that the Empire would cede parts of their homeland after all they had sacrificed to liberate it. Thus, the descendants of Yokuda rejected the White Gold Concordat and fought on, and Emperor Titus was forced to relinquish Hammerfell from the Empire. Remarkably, the warriors of the Alikir managed to fight the Elves to a standstill, and in 180, the Thalmor withdrew, having failed to annex any territory permanently, but having weakened the Empire further nonetheless by sowing seeds of bitterness between the Imperials and the Redguards. Meanwhile in Skyrim, the outlawing of Talos worship caused great social chaos within Nordic society. Ever since his ascension to godhood, Tiber Septim had become a deity that rivaled Shor and Kain in his importance to Nordic worship. Tensions soon grew between the Nords who would, at least ostensibly, give up their faith in Stormcrown, at least until the Empire was strong enough to fight the Thalmor once more, and Nords who refused to relinquish their religious and cultural freedom, and wished to forge a new future for themselves free of the Empire and its new elven puppet masters. The year was now 201. Ulfric Stormcloak, the Jarl of Windhelm, has assassinated Turig, the High King of Skyrim, plunging the province into civil war. From wings on high, the World Eater returns to Mundus to bring about the Kalpa's End, and on the path to Helgen, an Imperial patrol catches a mysterious figure trying to cross the border into Skyrim. As all this happens, Tamriel stands on the precipice of war, as the Empire and the Thalmor, acknowledging their peace to be implicitly temporary, each make their preparations for round 2. Will the tradition of human empires endure as the Fourth Age progresses, or will the legacy of Alesia, Remen and Tiber come crashing down as a new Merethic age dawns? Much more lies in the uncertain future, and perhaps only the Elder Scrolls themselves know what fate has in store. We're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We'll try to read and respond to every comment, as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.